It always seems like, commercial innovation is just rocketing ahead, moving at warp speed, while defense technology just kind of crawls along.
Yeah, it can feel that way.
But for those of you out there who are really tracking these developments closely, what if there was actually a very real concerted effort to change that pace?
Right.
To kind of inject a little bit of the Silicon Valley energy and speed into the Pentagon?
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to dive into today.
We're going to unpack Section 309 of the Forged Act.
Okay.
Now, I know that might sound a little bit dry, like dense legal jargon.
Sure.
But trust me, for you, understanding this particular section is absolutely key to understanding how the DoD, the Department of Defense, is really trying to change to overhaul its approach to acquiring the latest, most cutting-edge technologies.
Right, because it's not just about the technology itself. It's about, how do you actually get it into the hands of the people who need it?
Exactly.
And how do you do that quickly?
And how do you do that in a way that actually makes sense?
Right.
And so specifically, we're focusing on the refinements that this section makes to what's called the Other Transaction Authority. You'll hear us refer to this as OTA.
OTA, yeah, it's a bit of an alphabet soup, isn't it?
It is.
All these acronyms in defense. But the idea behind it, the core concept, is actually really interesting because it's essentially a tool
Right.
that the DoD can use to sort of work around, kind of go around some of those really rigid traditional procurement processes.
Exactly.
All the red tape that you always hear about. And the idea is to access innovation, particularly research and development, from companies that might not typically work with the government.
That's exactly right. These non-traditional defense contractors.
Yeah, the NDCs.
The NDCs.
And this isn't brand new. I mean, this isn't something that just popped up overnight. This has been, kind of in the works for a while.
To evolving, right?
Evolving, yeah.
Yeah.
So NASA actually started using a similar type of approach way back in 1958. And the DoD kind of came on board with this in 1989.
Okay.
But initially, it was through a different legal code. It was under 10 U.S.C. Section 2371, and now it's under Section 422. So it's been kind of moving around and shifting.
It's interesting how these things evolve.
Yeah.
But our mission for you in this deep dive is to really kind of get into the nuts and bolts of what Section 309 actually does.
Okay.
Like, what are the specific changes? What's new here? Why were those changes deemed necessary?
Right.
What are the potential upsides? But also, what are the potential downsides? Because there always are, right?
Sure.
For those of you out there tracking defense innovation, these are things you need to be aware of.
Yeah, you got to look at both sides of the coin.
Absolutely. And ultimately, we want to ask the question, what does this all mean for actually getting that cutting-edge tech, that advanced technology, into the hands of the warfighters who need it the most?
Yeah.
So by the end of our time together, you should have a really clear understanding of these important shifts.
All right, so let's kind of rewind a little bit and unpack the why behind this whole Section 309. Because, I mean, as you just said, OTAs have been around for a while.
They have, yeah.
So what was it about the existing process, that prompted these kind of new refinements?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the original intent, like the thinking behind OTAs from the start, was actually very smart.
Okay.
It was to really try to tap into that innovative potential that often exists outside of those traditional defense contractors.
Right.
Right. And specifically for research and development. So stuff that the traditional procurement system might just completely overlook.
Right, because it's so focused on, the big established players.
Exactly. And there were some successes early on.
Oh, sure.
There were definitely some wins. But as the use of OTAs expanded and they started to get used more and more, various reports, and you might remember some of these, particularly from the Government Accountability Office and the GAO.
Oh, yeah, the GAO, they're always keeping an eye on things.
They are. They started to highlight some inconsistencies in how OTAs were being applied, and also some gaps in the oversight.
Right.
So for those of you following government accountability, this is interesting stuff.
Yeah.
It wasn't always a smooth process.
Right. So it wasn't perfect right out of the gate.
Not entirely.
And on top of that, the scope of what OTAs could actually be used for continued to grow over time.
Right.
Like the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA.
Right.
That was a big one because it added prototypes to the list of things you could actually, acquire through OTAs.
Yeah, that was a significant expansion.
Yeah. And then you had subsequent NDAs, like the one in 2018 that went even further.
Right.
They started including options for follow-on production.
Right.
So you could not only develop the prototype, but you could actually start to, get it into production. And this was actually pretty much in line with recommendations that had been coming out from the Defense Science Board.
Right.
They had been advocating for more flexibility, in that transition from a successful prototype to a real, fielded capability.
Exactly. So for those of you interested in defense strategy, this is something you would have likely noticed, this push for more flexibility.
Yeah. So it was kind of like this growing recognition that, okay, we need to speed this process up.
Yeah.
We need to be able to get these promising prototypes out into the field quicker.
Absolutely.
And that was a major driver behind these changes.
Right. And studies, actual studies from resources like innovation.defense.gov and discover.deedic.mil, they actually pointed out that while OTAs had the potential for rapid fielding, that potential was being limited by those existing financial thresholds.
Right.
Like how much money could actually be spent through an OTA.
Right.
And there was also some lack of clarity in the actual legal authority governing OTAs.
Okay, so it's kind of like the rules weren't quite clear enough and the amount of money you could use was limited.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where Senator Wicker's bill comes in.
Okay.
It's S.5618, introduced in late 2024.
Yes, okay.
And specifically Section 309 of that bill.
Okay.
This is the latest effort to really address this and try to give acquisition speed a boost. This is something you definitely want to keep track of.
Okay, so that's the background, that's the context, but let's get into the specifics. Like, what's actually new here? What are the key changes, that you think are really important for our listeners to understand?
So there are a few key things that have changed, some pretty significant modifications.
Okay.
And probably the most impactful is the change to the financial threshold. So they've increased the OT threshold to $100 million.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So that's a big change. And the reason behind that is they're trying to streamline those larger projects, especially the ones that involve both prototypes and even those initial production runs.
Right, because before it was a lot less, right?
I mean, significantly less, yeah.
So this is a pretty big jump.
It's a big jump. And the thinking is that by raising that limit, it'll reduce those bureaucratic hurdles for those more substantial and potentially really game-changing projects.
So less red tape, less paperwork.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Especially if you're trying to move quickly.
Right, exactly. For those of you tracking defense spending, this is a really noteworthy increase.
Yeah, $100 million is a significant chunk of change.
Absolutely.
What else is new here?
Okay, so another really crucial change is they've clarified the role of what's called the head of contracting activity.
Okay.
Now, this is aimed at ensuring a more consistent, a more high-level oversight across all these OTA agreements.
Right. So it's kind of like they're trying to make sure that there's someone, high up who's really paying attention to this.
Exactly. And by making that responsibility really clear, defining who that person is, the hope is that it brings a more strategic, more unified approach to how OTAs are actually used.
Okay, so it's not just about, signing off on paperwork. It's about really thinking strategically about how these things are being used.
Exactly. Yeah. And this focus on consistency, that's something that should be of interest to those of you who are concerned with, efficient government operations.
Yeah, absolutely. So more strategic focus, more high-level attention.
Right.
Hopefully leading to better outcomes for the people who are actually using this stuff.
Precisely.
Okay, what else is new here?
Okay, so another change, and this is a big one, is they've broadened the definition of follow-on production.
Follow-on production, okay.
Yeah. And this is especially relevant for those of you who are interested in how prototypes transition to actual use in the field. So the intent here is to make that whole transition from a successful prototype developed under an OTA to the actual production and fielding of that technology much smoother.
Right, because before it was kind of like you'd hit this wall, right? You'd develop the prototype, and then there'd be this whole other process to actually get it into production.
Yeah, exactly. It could get very bogged down.
Yeah.
So they've expanded the definition of follow-on production to include a lot more activities that relate to getting that prototype into production.
Okay, so they're basically trying to kind of grease the wheels a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
To get things moving faster.
To make that transition much smoother, much quicker.
Okay, so that sounds like it could really accelerate the deployment of, some of these really promising technologies.
That's the goal.
eliminate some of those delays that we were just talking about.
Exactly.
Okay. Anything else?
Yes, actually. So Section 309 now explicitly allows for something called rapid production awards.
Rapid production awards. Okay.
So this is where they can actually award production contracts without going through that traditional competitive bidding process.
Okay.
But this is only in very specific situations.
Right.
Where there is a clearly demonstrated urgent need from the warfighter.
Okay, so it's like an emergency situation.
Right.
We need this technology now.
Exactly. So the idea here is about having that agility to really quickly get those critical capabilities to the people who need them most when they need them.
Right, because in some cases, time is the most valuable thing.
It absolutely is.
So you can't be bogged down in, months and months of a process.
Exactly. And this flexibility that's been introduced is something that you'll probably see debated a lot in the coming months and years.
Okay. And the final change here.
So the final major element is the enhanced flexibility that's been given to the directors of those key innovation hubs within the DoD.
Okay.
So specifically, we're talking about DARPA, the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, and the Missile Defense Agency, MDA.
Okay.
So this section basically gives them more freedom to really foster innovation through their use of OTAs.
So it's kind of like they're giving more leeway to the people who are, right there on the cutting edge.
Exactly. And for you, this means that those agencies that are really focused on those bleeding edge technologies, they're being empowered.
Okay, so that's all good news, right? Like we're trying to speed things up, we're trying to give more flexibility, but as we kind of hinted at earlier, there are always potential downsides to any change this big.
There are. You're absolutely right. It's always a balancing act.
Right.
And so one potential concern, and you should be aware of this, is with those higher financial thresholds, there's a greater risk of reduced scrutiny.
Right, because when you're dealing with more money, there's always that potential for things to go wrong, for costs to overrun, for people to maybe not be quite as careful with the money.
Yeah, that's a very valid concern.
Okay, what else? What are some other potential downsides?
So another thing to consider is, we talked about how they clarify the role of the head of contracting activity.
Right.
But that includes non-delegable authority in some pretty key areas.
Okay.
Now, while the intent there is to make sure that there's, high-level attention, accountability, it could actually lead to bottlenecks.
Okay.
If those individuals become overwhelmed, if they have too much on their plate.
Right, because then everything has to kind of go through them.
Yeah, and that can slow things down.
Yeah, it can create a bottleneck.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so that's something to watch out for.
Yeah, it's a potential pinch point, as they say.
Exactly. And then, we talked about the broadened definition of follow-on production.
Right.
Which is intended to streamline those transitions, which is good.
Right.
But it could also blur the lines a little bit.
Okay.
Between what's a prototype effort and what's full-scale production.
Right, because those are two very different things.
They are.
And if the lines get blurry, then it could get confusing.
It could create some real complexities in how these agreements are structured, how they're managed.
Right.
And so that's something to watch out for.
Right. So that's something to keep in mind as you're, evaluating future OTA projects.
Absolutely.
And what about those non-competitive awards?
Right.
The ones for rapid fielding. I mean, that kind of raises some questions about fairness.
It does. And it's a valid concern.
Right.
Because if you don't have that traditional competitive process, there is a potential for limited fairness.
Right.
And maybe even some unintended favoritism towards certain contractors.
Right, because, if you don't have to compete, then maybe you don't have to be as sharp.
Exactly.
And the other thing we talked about was the risk of prioritizing speed over quality.
Right.
I mean, that's a big one, especially in the defense context, right? When lives are on the line.
Yeah, and when you're pushing to get things out the door quickly, there's always that temptation to maybe cut corners.
Right.
And so you could end up with systems that haven't been fully tested, haven't been properly validated.
Right.
And that could have real consequences.
Yeah, that's a scary thought.
It is. It is. And so that's a really critical trade-off that you as someone who's informed, who's following this closely, you need to be thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about some pretty significant potential downsides here. I mean, things that could really go wrong.
Right.
But You know, I'm assuming that the people who wrote this, this forged act, they weren't naive to these things.
Oh, no, they weren't.
So what are they doing to mitigate these risks? Like what strategies are in place to try to prevent these things from happening?
So the good news is the Forged Act itself and the planning that's been going on since then, it's addressing these concerns. So, for example, to mitigate those cost overruns that we talked about with the higher thresholds, they're going to implement periodic, really in-depth cost reviews.
Okay.
Specifically for those high-value OTA agreements.
So they're basically going to be checking in regularly, making sure that things are on track.
Exactly.
Okay. And what about those potential bottlenecks? The possibility that things could get slowed down because you've got, these individuals who have all this authority and they might get overwhelmed.
Right. So to counter that, they're planning to streamline those internal approval processes.
Okay.
And they're going to establish clear timelines for decision making.
So everyone knows, how long things are supposed to take.
Exactly. And that should help to prevent things from getting bogged down.
Okay, so it's all about efficiency and clear expectations.
Right.
And what about the confusion between prototypes and production?
So to address that, the DoD is going to issue really clear guidance that spells out very specifically the difference between the prototype phase, which is done under an OTA, and any subsequent follow-on production.
Okay, so they're basically drawing a line in the sand.
Yes.
And saying this is prototype, this is production.
Precisely.
Okay. So that really should provide some much needed clarity.
It should.
And what about the fairness concerns with the non-competitive awards?
So in those cases, they're going to have mandatory justification audits.
Okay.
So that means that whenever someone decides to give a non-competitive award, they're going to have to document very thoroughly why they did that.
Okay.
And that documentation will be reviewed, it will be audited, and it will have to be fully justifiable based on the urgent need.
So they can't just, give it to their buddy or something like that.
No, there has to be a real reason.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. This adds a layer of accountability.
Yeah.
That, is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, how are they going to make sure that speed doesn't trump quality?
So they're going to enforce minimum testing standards.
Okay.
And this is before any system is considered for rapid fielding.
Okay.
So even if there's a really urgent need, they're still going to have to make sure that system meets certain basic requirements.
Okay.
For reliability, for effectiveness, and of course for safety.
Right.
So this is a non-negotiable.
Okay, so it's not just, get it out there and we'll worry about the consequences later.
No, absolutely not.
Okay, that's good.
So, there are some safeguards in place.
Yeah, definitely. So looking inside the DoD now, I mean, who are the key players here? Who are the people who are going to be most affected by these changes?
Well, it's going to have a pretty noticeable impact on a few different groups within the department.
Okay.
So first off, you've got the heads of contracting activities.
Right.
They're definitely going to have a much bigger role now.
Right.
Because they're going to be overseeing these potentially much larger OTAs.
Right, with all that extra money.
Yeah, exactly. So they're going to need to be involved in those more strategic, higher level decisions.
Right, because when you're dealing with bigger sums of money, you need to have, people who are higher up involved.
Absolutely.
Okay, so more responsibility for them.
Right. And then you've got the directors of those innovation hubs that we talked about.
Okay.
DARPA, DIU,
yes.
MDA.
Right.
They're going to have more authority, more autonomy.
Okay.
Especially in those areas where they have non-delegable authority.
Right.
So they're really being empowered to drive innovation.
Okay, so more authority, but also probably more accountability.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. They're going to be held responsible for the results.
Yeah.
And then you've got the service acquisition executives.
Okay.
They're going to have a bigger role too, especially when it comes to justifying those rapid production awards.
Right.
Because they're the ones who are going to have to make the case for why they need to bypass that traditional competitive process.
Right. So they're going to have to be very clear and very persuasive.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then you've got the contracting officers,
right.
The people who are, actually managing these agreements day to day.
Right.
They're going to need to develop some new skills.
Okay.
They're going to need some new expertise to deal with these more complex OT agreements.
Right, because it's a whole different world than traditional procurement.
It is.
Okay.
It is. So there's going to be a need for training, for professional development.
Yeah, they're going to have to kind of up their game a little bit.
Exactly.
So it sounds like, across the board, there's going to be some adaptation needed.
There is.
But what about outside the DoD? Are there any, groups or stakeholders who might have concerns about these changes or maybe even see opportunities?
Yeah, definitely. So, one group that might be a little bit apprehensive are those traditional defense contractors.
Okay.
Because they might be worried that with the increase in non-competitive awards, particularly the ones that are going to these non-traditional defense contractors, that there might be fewer opportunities for them.
Right, because they're used to, doing things the traditional way.
Exactly.
And this is kind of shaking things up a bit.
It is. Yeah. It is. And then you've got congressional overseers.
Yeah.
They might have some questions, too, especially about the potential for less transparency.
Right.
Because, when you're dealing with these larger deals, these non-competitive awards, it can be harder to track the money.
Yeah.
And so they're going to want to make sure that things are being done properly.
Right, because they're the ones who are ultimately responsible to the taxpayers.
Exactly.
Okay. And what about the watchdogs within the DoD?
Right. So you've got the auditors, the inspectors general.
Right.
They're likely to be watching this very closely.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to rapid fielding, because they're going to want to make sure that the proper checks and balances are in place.
Right.
Even when things are moving really fast.
Yeah. So a lot of potential for friction there.
Yeah, there is.
But, hopefully they can work through it.
Hopefully.
So we've talked about the people, but what about resources? I mean, what other resources is the DoD going to need to actually implement these changes? I mean, it's not just about, changing the rules on paper.
No, it's not. It's going to take more than that.
Right.
So there are a few key areas where they're going to need resources.
Okay.
First off, they're going to need to invest in some better OT tracking systems.
Okay.
Because with more OTAs, and especially with these larger ones, they're going to need better ways to manage them, to monitor them.
Right, to keep track of everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then they're going to need more training.
Okay.
Because you can't just change the rules and expect everyone to know what to do.
Right.
So they're going to need to train people on these new rules, these new processes.
Okay, so training is going to be a big one.
It is. And then finally, they're probably going to need more people.
Okay.
Because, with more OTAs, with more oversight, there's going to be more work.
Right, yeah. More work, more people.
Exactly.
Okay, so a lot of resources needed.
There are.
But, at the end of the day, how are we going to know if this is actually working? Yeah. Like, what are the metrics for success?
So they've actually identified some very specific metrics that they're going to be tracking.
Okay.
And one of the key ones is the speed of the award process.
Okay.
They want to reduce the time it takes to award OTAs by 25%.
Wow. Okay. So they're really aiming for a significant speed up there.
They are.
Okay. What else?
They also want to see a 20% increase in the use of rapid fielding.
Okay.
So they want to see that expedited process being used more often.
Okay. So not just faster, but more often.
Exactly. And then ultimately, the most important metric is going to be the success rate of the actual deployments.
Yeah, okay.
So they want to see a 90% or higher success rate in deploying these capabilities and making sure that they actually meet the requirements.
Okay, so they're not just, throwing stuff out there and hoping for the best.
No, they want to make sure that it's actually working.
Right. Okay, so those are some pretty ambitious goals.
They are.
It'll be interesting to see how they do.
Yeah, and they're going to be tracking these metrics annually.
Okay, so we'll be able to see, year by year how they're doing.
Exactly.
Were there any other, approaches or strategies that they considered before they landed on these specific changes in Section 309?
Yeah, actually, there were a few different ideas that were kicked around.
Okay.
One of them was to have different OT thresholds for different agencies or for different types of technologies.
Okay.
So instead of having one uniform threshold, they could have tailored it to the specific circumstances.
Right, so it would be more flexible.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then another idea that was explored was to develop a digital OT management platform.
Oh, okay.
So this would be, a software system that would help to manage the whole OT process.
Okay.
And this could potentially improve efficiency, improve transparency.
Yeah.
And maybe even make some of these legislative changes unnecessary.
Okay, interesting. So maybe we'll see that in the future.
Maybe.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
So just to kind of recap, Section 309 of the Forged Act,
right.
It's really about trying to inject some much-needed speed and agility into the DoD's acquisition process.
Right.
And they're doing this through this refined and enhanced other transaction authority, the OTA.
Yeah.
But it's a delicate balancing act,
Right.
right?